It was 1983, and I was a Mossad agent on a mission deep in Libya. The air was thick with the stench of dust, sulfur, and the occasional acrid fumes from chemical plants we passed. Our objective was buried in layers of secrecy, so classified that even the coordinates were coded. I cannot reveal the location or its full purpose, but it was the first time I truly understood what it meant to confront the unknown. Each man on my team had a unique role, specialized, trained for missions like this, though none could predict how this would unfold. We were dropped in at night, the barren desert stretching endlessly in front of us. Our boots scraped against the cracked earth, each step heavy with anticipation. Overhead, the stars twinkled coldly, indifferent to our presence, but the silence of the desert was not comforting. It felt like we were trespassing on something far older than us. The feeling was subtle at first, like a low hum beneath the ground that I could not place. It gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside. There was work to do. The briefing had been succinct. Anomalous readings had been detected in a region of military interest, some kind of black site that had been abandoned years ago. The Libyan government had covered up its existence. Our mission was simple: infiltrate, confirm, and extract anything of value. The technology, the intel, whatever it was, had to be retrieved. We had no idea that the value was something beyond human comprehension, beyond technology. There was no sound as the helicopter lifted off, just the sharp hiss of the rotor blades and the occasional crackle from the communication system. The tension was palpable in the cramped interior, where the air tasted metallic, charged, like the very atmosphere was warning us of something. I glanced at my team, but their faces were masks, each of us locked in our own thoughts. Nothing about this mission seemed right, but none of us spoke of it. Not yet. We had no reason to. Our mission had the typical military overtones of Cold War operations, discreet, clean, and without questions. Mossad had the best equipment, but we were not alone. Other intelligence agencies had their eyes on Libya too, each hoping to get a piece of whatever was buried beneath the desert. The stakes were high, even for a covert operation, because whatever lay buried in that black site had the potential to shift power dynamics. That was the official reasoning anyway. I have come to believe that the truth was far darker than anything we were told. The world had just begun to feel the tremors of geopolitics shifting, with the Cold War in full swing. Superpowers maneuvered their proxies, and intelligence agencies like ours were tasked with ensuring the game was played with the right balance of power. We had our orders: extract intelligence, secure any technology, and ensure nothing dangerous was left behind. The Libyan military had been mysteriously tight-lipped on this site, almost as though they were afraid of what had once been there. Our team was specially selected for this mission because of our varied expertise, each one of us possessing a specific skill set that could be applied to any situation. To any outsider, it would have appeared like a typical mission, one of many we had executed in the region. But there was a peculiar sense of urgency that accompanied it. The reports from satellites had come back with anomalies, spiking energy readings, unexplained emissions, the type of signals that screamed of something out of the ordinary. At first, we thought it was just another glitch, another radar failure. But after cross-checking multiple sources, the signal became something we could no longer ignore. It was almost as though whatever we were hunting had noticed us first. As the transport aircraft descended, the landscape below unfolded like an ancient map, stretching toward a horizon that seemed both far away and dangerously close. The team kept their eyes on the mission ahead, but the unease I felt was contagious. The subtle, unspoken knowledge that we were not just on the brink of a military discovery, but standing on the threshold of something far older, something far more alien, pressed down on my chest. The real question we should have been asking was not what was buried there, but who or what was waiting for us. Our team was composed of 5 highly trained agents, each with specialized skills that complemented one another. Each one was handpicked for this operation, but no one was truly prepared for what we would find. The mix of professionalism and subtle personal histories made each of us unique. Yet that day, under the suffocating heat of the Libyan desert sun, we became something else, unified by the fear of the unknown. In the end, it was that fear that would bind us together. First, there was Captain Ziv, the team leader. He had a reputation for being a rock in the storm, calm, analytical, and always 10 steps ahead. His eyes, dark and sharp, missed nothing. He was the tactical genius, the one who kept our plans organized and our minds focused. Ziv was never one for unnecessary words. He believed that the mission always came first, a philosophy that made him respected and feared in equal measure. What struck me most about him was his silence. He never seemed rattled, even when something didn't feel right. There were times when I thought he might not feel anything at all, but I learned that beneath that cold exterior, there was an intense pressure building, one that only a few could see. Then there was Rami, our medic. He had a calm, soothing presence that stood in stark contrast to the rest of us. Where the rest of us carried the weight of our skills like weapons, Rami carried his knowledge like a shield. He knew the human body, its weaknesses, its strengths, its limits. But as the mission wore on, I saw that his scientific mind was being stretched to its very edge. What happened to him, what he began to witness, pushed him into realms of uncertainty he had never known. His eyes grew distant in the days that followed, and his clinical detachment began to warp into something far more haunted. I would come to realize that the horrors we were facing had affected him far more deeply than any of us could have predicted. Kafir, our demolitions expert, was reckless, unpredictable, but a genius in his own right. With him, you never knew if the next joke or explosive charge was going to tear apart a building or blow a hole in the sand beneath our feet. He was the risk-taker, and of course he was also the first to see things begin to unravel. The signs were there. His hands would twitch at strange moments, as though something beyond our understanding was pulling at his very soul. Kafir was the one who first spoke aloud about hearing voices. I dismissed it at the time as stress-induced paranoia, but later I would find out that Kafir's recklessness had more to do with what was being done to him than with any desire for danger. His transformation was perhaps the most grotesque of us all. Dove, our communications specialist, was the quietest among us. His job was to maintain the link between our team and headquarters, to ensure that we had constant communication, both with each other and the higher-ups. The equipment he handled was state-of-the-art, capable of transmitting through the thickest of interference, yet I could see something shift in him as the hours wore on. Dov became altered. It started with the humming in his earpiece, a low, insistent frequency that no one else could hear. And when he spoke over the comms, his voice changed, as though something, or someone, was speaking through him. By the end of our mission, Dov had become a conduit, channeling something that none of us understood. It was chilling. Lastly, there was me. The newest recruit, the one tasked with collecting intel, analyzing data, and following orders. My skills were honed in the field, and I was eager to prove myself. But as the mission unfolded, I found that no amount of training or preparation could have steeled me for the nightmare we were about to enter. I was not a leader like Ziv, nor a scientist like Rami, nor a technician like Dov. I was just a soldier, a cog in a much larger machine. But by the end, I was forced to become something else entirely. We were briefed in a small, sterile room deep within the confines of a Mossad safe house. The walls were blank, save for a single projection screen. A low hum filled the air, punctuated by the occasional clink of boots on the concrete floor as our team assembled. Captain Ziv stood at the front, his posture straight, eyes locked on the map displayed before us. He did not speak a word as the image of the facility flickered to life. It was hidden deep within the desert, far from any civilian settlements, and protected by an array of natural and man-made obstacles. "We have reason to believe that something was left behind there," Ziv said finally, his voice steady but with a certain weight to it. "What exactly, we do not know, but we have been tasked with retrieving whatever it is, and if necessary, securing it under any circumstances. This is a high-risk operation, but failure is not an option. We cannot afford to draw attention." The tension was palpable as he clicked through the slides. The terrain was harsh, unforgiving, with a network of caves and underground tunnels said to be the core of the installation. According to satellite images, there was an anomaly in the radiation levels deep within the facility. These disturbances did not match any known military or scientific data, leading our intelligence officers to hypothesize that whatever was left behind could either be an ancient weapon or technology far ahead of its time. Either way, our task was to retrieve it, by any means necessary. Our mission was to infiltrate the facility without alerting any Libyan forces nearby, extract the relevant data, and confirm what lay within. It was described to us as a black site, one abandoned by the Libyan government but holding secrets the world could never know. I had little doubt that the knowledge locked within that place was of immense power, but there was something else about that briefing, something Ziv kept to himself, that gnawed at me. The way he avoided looking at the map when the radiation anomaly came up, the way his words felt just a little too rehearsed. It was as if he knew we were going into something far beyond what any of us could handle. Kiefer, ever the joker, cracked his usual grin as he checked the explosives pack strapped to his back. "If it's all a bunch of old weapons tech, we're going to have a great time blowing things up," he muttered, though there was no laughter in his voice. Even he, ever the daredevil, felt the gravity of the mission. I looked over at Rami, who was reviewing the medical supplies. His face was blank, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something else, something uneasy. As for Dov, he was busy calibrating the communications equipment, but his hands were trembling ever so slightly, his usually steady fingers hesitant as he adjusted the frequency settings. Once we were fully briefed, we suited up, standard operational gear, heavy body armor, and communication devices. Each of us silently checked our weapons, our equipment, ensuring everything was in place. There was no need for speeches. We knew the stakes. We knew that our lives, and possibly the world's, depended on what we would find buried under the earth. The helicopter that would carry us into the desert waited outside, engines idling, a loud roar that reverberated against the barren landscape. We boarded without a word, the thick door sliding shut behind us with a metallic thud. As the chopper lifted off, the harsh wind slapped against the windows, the dark desert floor growing smaller beneath us. I stared out at the endless void below, my mind whirling with the unknown. There were no guarantees in our line of work, only cold calculations and the unspoken agreement that we were expendable. Yet there was something about this mission, something about the facility, that gnawed at me. As we flew closer to the drop zone, a strange quiet settled in the cabin. The hum of the helicopter's blades became background noise to the sudden dread building within me. The desert felt too still, too empty. I glanced around at my teammates, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The uneasy tension in the air had become palpable. And I knew, no matter how much we prepared, no matter how many protocols we followed, that what awaited us was not something we could control. The helicopter banked sharply to the right, cutting through the dry desert wind with an unsettling roar. Below, the sand stretched endlessly, an ocean of ochre and brown that seemed to ripple with heat. There were no landmarks, just the harsh, unforgiving terrain that stretched for miles in every direction. The GPS coordinates flickered on the screen, confirming what we already knew. We were heading into the heart of nothingness. Nothing in this barren wasteland seemed alive, and yet the air felt charged, as if something unseen watched us from the shadows. The flight felt like an eternity, each minute dragging on under the weight of the unknown. Despite the low hum of the helicopter, the silence inside was oppressive, almost suffocating. The air felt dense, thick with the sensation that something or someone was waiting. Dov kept adjusting his comms, his brow furrowed, but every so often he would glance out the window as though searching for something. His usual calm demeanor had cracked. As we descended, I could feel the temperature change. The outside air grew hotter, drier, as if the very atmosphere had been sealed in some ancient trap. We could see the facility now, an old compound half buried beneath the sand. It had been left to decay over the years, its edges eroded by time, but even from the air, it felt wrong. There was a sense of unnatural order to its layout, as if the structure had been placed there deliberately, positioned just so, as if it were meant to be discovered. The chopper hovered for a moment, the blades chopping through the still air. The ground was a maze of ancient buildings, winding tunnels and sunken chambers that looked as though they had once been part of a sprawling underground complex. We were going in blind, and the weight of that blindness sat heavily on me. We had little to go on beyond satellite imagery, a few scattered reports, and the data from the radiation spikes. There were no answers to any of the questions that gnawed at me. What had happened here? Who had left it all behind, and why? The descent continued, slower now, almost hesitant, as if the aircraft itself sensed the eerie emptiness below. The chopper touched down with a soft thud, and the rotor blades slowed, but the ground felt alive underfoot. My boots hit the sand, and it shifted beneath me as though it too were a living thing. I could feel a strange vibration in the earth, subtle at first, but growing as I took a few steps away from the helicopter. The others had already disembarked, and I followed suit, my senses on edge. We were positioned outside a crumbling wall that bordered the facility, a wall that once might have held some form of defense. A single entrance gaped open before us, an archway half buried in the sand, its frame covered in strange symbols. The symbols pulsed faintly, barely perceptible at first, but unmistakable once they were noticed. They glowed faintly, casting soft, sickly light against the surrounding sand. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I didn't speak. None of us did. We were waiting for something. Ziv gave the signal, and we advanced in a tight formation, moving cautiously through the ruins. The air was thick, heavy, and the smell of decay was overpowering. The wind stirred, but there was no breeze. It was as though the air itself was stagnant, trapped in an eternal moment. Each step we took seemed to make the ground tremble underfoot. I glanced over at Rami, who seemed deep in thought, his face pale, his eyes wide. He was breathing slowly, methodically, as though trying to calm himself, but I could tell he was as unsettled as I was. The walls of the compound loomed over us, the ancient stone coated in a fine layer of dust. But there was something about the stone, something off about the way it reflected the light. It didn't seem to absorb the sun's rays. Instead, it seemed to exude an unnatural glow, faint but undeniable. I looked up at Ziv, but he was silent, his eyes scanning the area, searching for something that was beyond the reach of our equipment. We moved deeper into the compound, passing through narrow corridors and shadowed hallways, our boots echoing off the stone. The temperature dropped suddenly, as though we had stepped into a cave, and the air became dense, cloying, with an almost metallic taste. I could hear faint whispers now, far in the distance, carried by the wind. They sounded like voices calling names, lost and fragmented. My skin prickled. Kefir glanced around, his eyes wild, and I could see that he was unnerved. "Did you hear that?" he muttered under his breath. But before anyone could respond, there was a sudden, sharp crack, a sound so loud that it seemed to rattle the very foundation of the walls around us. We froze. The crack echoed for what seemed like an eternity, and in that moment, every shadow in the room seemed to stretch and shift, bending in unnatural ways. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. Something had changed. Something was wrong. The silence that followed the crack was more oppressive than anything I had ever experienced. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath, suspended in some unseen force. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the dark, narrow hallway we had entered. The walls seemed to pulse, their surfaces shifting subtly, as though they were alive, breathing. My senses were on edge, every sound magnified, every movement unsettling. There was something in the air, something intangible, but it was there, pressing in on me from all sides. Ziv raised his hand, signaling for us to halt. He was still, his face etched with concentration. His usual calm was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar tension. I could see him scanning the space around us, eyes flicking back and forth. The shadows, once still, seemed to stretch unnaturally. For a moment I thought I saw them move, as though something was watching us from within them, something that existed outside of normal space. But when I blinked, it was gone. Rami moved forward cautiously, his medical bag clinking softly against his side as he went. His footsteps seemed louder than they should have been in the oppressive quiet. He stopped after a few paces, turning to look back at us. His face was ashen, eyes wide, filled with an unease I had never seen before. "There is something here," he muttered under his breath. "Something Alive. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried through the corridor like a scream in the silence. We all froze. Kafir, ever the skeptic, scoffed, but the edge in his voice betrayed his own growing discomfort. "What are you talking about, Rami? It's just the heat messing with your head." But Rami didn't respond. He was staring at the walls, his fingers tracing the air as though he could feel something just out of reach. I could see him shiver, and the tension in the air seemed to thicken with each passing second. Dav was already working on the comms, muttering under his breath, but I could barely hear him. The static was overwhelming, buzzing in the earpieces like a swarm of angry insects. "Dav, can you get a read on the surroundings?" Ziv asked, his voice steady but tight. Dav didn't answer immediately. His hands shook slightly as he fiddled with the equipment, his gaze distant. Then, finally, he spoke. "There's something blocking our signal, something big. I can't... Wait, there's another frequency coming through. Not normal." Before anyone could react, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the stone beneath our feet. It started as a whisper, a faint buzzing, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost deafening. It seemed to come from everywhere, from inside the walls, from the very air itself. The sound was foreign, an alien frequency, one that none of our equipment could process. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a tingling sensation on the back of my neck, and I knew without a doubt that we were no longer alone. Something was here. We weren't just intruders. We were trespassing on something far older and far more powerful than we could ever understand. Ziv motioned for us to continue, and we moved cautiously, stepping through the hallways of the facility, the echoes of our footsteps the only sound that broke the heavy silence. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The temperature dropped again, and I could feel the air growing thicker, heavier, as though it were pressing in from all sides. Each step felt like we were moving through a tunnel, a deep, dark hole that led to some unknown place. We reached a large chamber, the walls of which were lined with strange symbols, glyphs I had never seen before. They glowed faintly, casting a sickly light that made the shadows stretch unnaturally. The center of the room was dominated by an enormous stone structure, its surface covered in more of the glowing symbols. It was like a monument, a shrine of some kind, though what it represented I had no idea. Ziv ordered us to stop. His eyes were locked on the stone structure, his expression unreadable. The hum was back now, vibrating through the air with a low, almost hypnotic resonance. The feeling in my chest tightened. There was something about this place, something that didn't belong in this world. Rami stepped forward cautiously, his eyes flicking from the symbols on the walls to the stone structure. This isn't human," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Whatever this is, it's not ours." Kafir scoffed again, his usual bravado failing to mask the growing terror in his voice. "Come on, it's just some old ruins. Let's blow it up and move on." But his voice faltered at the end, his words trailing off as though he wasn't entirely convinced by his own bravado. There was a sudden, sharp crack from somewhere deeper within the facility, a sound like the splitting of stone, or perhaps something far worse. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced over at Ziv. His face had gone pale, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. The air in the room had grown dense, suffocating. Something was coming. Something was waking up. Before we could react, the lights flickered, casting the room in alternating darkness and sickly light. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. And then, a voice, soft, distant, yet somehow impossibly close, whispered through the room. It spoke in a language I did not recognize, its tone neither malevolent nor kind, but detached, as though it were simply repeating something that had been waiting for a long time to be heard. The air seemed to freeze around us, and then, without warning, the shadows moved. The shadows moved in a way that defied reason. At first it was subtle, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shift in the darkened edges of the room. But then it became undeniable. The walls, the very air itself, began to distort. The space around us bent in impossible ways, as if the geometry of the facility was breaking down. I could feel my mind straining against it, but there was no escape from the overwhelming presence that had settled over us. Ziv was the first to react, his calm demeanor faltering for just a moment as he glanced toward the shifting darkness. "Stay focused," he commanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the haze of fear that was beginning to settle on us. We moved forward. Secure the area. We advanced cautiously, though every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to escape. But I was not alone. None of us were. There was something drawing us deeper into this place, something that felt older than the desert itself. We moved as one in tight formation, each of us scanning the environment for any signs of movement or danger. But it was difficult to keep track of anything. The shadows were now twisting, contorting like living things, stretching and retracting in ways that defied all natural law. The lights above flickered intermittently, casting jagged glows on the walls, which seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. Rami was the first to speak, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "These markings, they're not from any known language." He paused, running his fingers along one of the glowing symbols. "This is something different." I could feel his words crawling under my skin. It was as though the very air around us was shifting with a life of its own. The walls felt less like stone and more like skin, soft, slick, and pulsating with some unseen force. I reached out instinctively, running my hand along the surface, and for a moment, I thought I felt something press back against my fingers. Something cold. And yet not. Kafir, always the skeptic, scoffed, but there was no conviction in his voice. "It's just some old ruins. Nothing more." But his words felt hollow, like he was trying to convince himself. He kept his hand on the detonators in his pack, as if the explosives might be the only thing that could make sense of this madness. I caught a glimpse of his face, sweat beading on his forehead, eyes wide with something more than fear. He wasn't sure anymore if this was just another mission. We weren't just walking through abandoned tunnels. We were entering a place that was alive with an intelligence far beyond our own comprehension. We continued forward, the facility growing increasingly disorienting. The hallways twisted in ways that didn't make sense. What should have been straight corridors seemed to loop back on themselves, and doorways opened into more doorways, as though we were being funneled into an ever-tightening maze. The sense of direction was lost. We could no longer rely on our compasses or our GPS equipment. Nothing was giving us a clear picture. Dov was clearly struggling with the radio equipment, his attempts at communication growing more frantic. I can't get a signal," he muttered, his voice trembling as he adjusted the frequency settings, but the static only deepened. "It's like the signals are being absorbed. Something's blocking it." That's when I felt it. The sensation of being watched. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I glanced over at Ziv, who had gone completely still, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the surroundings. He gave no sign that he felt the same unease, but I could tell. His posture was too tense, too alert. There was a low rumble, the ground vibrating beneath our boots. The hum that had been lingering in the background grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the air until it felt as though the entire facility was alive. The walls seemed to pulse, like the rhythm of a heartbeat, quickening, deepening. Something was happening. Something was waking up. I looked to Rami, whose face was pale. He kept shaking his head, muttering to himself in disbelief. No, this isn't possible." His voice cracked, and for a brief moment, I saw the cracks in his calm facade. "This place, it's like it's feeding on us. It's trying to understand us." Ziv stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "Stay together. We've been ordered to secure the intel. Focus. Move forward. Now." There was no argument, but as we moved deeper into the facility, it became clear that what we were walking into wasn't just a military installation. It wasn't just a repository of weapons or knowledge. It was something far more profound and far more dangerous. I could feel the air growing thick with something I couldn't place. A presence that didn't belong here, a force that wasn't human. And then suddenly there it was. A doorway that hadn't been there before. A massive stone archway at the end of the corridor, one that had been concealed behind layers of dust and debris. As we approached, the shadows seemed to gather, pressing against the edges of the room, as if they too were waiting. The glow from the symbols on the walls intensified, casting an eerie light over the space. We stood before the door. And as we reached out to open it, the humming grew louder, filling the entire chamber with its pulse. But this time it was different. This time we heard something else. A voice. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't in any language we recognized, but somehow we understood it. The voice seemed to echo from all around us, as though the very walls were speaking. Come. The word was simple, yet its resonance carried with it an ancient power, a force that called us forward into the unknown. As the voice reverberated through the walls, we froze. There was something undeniably wrong about the sound. It wasn't just a command. It was a summons, something ancient and primal. I felt my heartbeat quicken, my pulse pounding in my ears as the words seemed to settle in my chest like an anchor, dragging me down. My feet refused to move for a moment, as if the very air was holding me back, wrapping around my legs like chains. Ziv stepped forward first, his hand brushing against the cold surface of the stone archway. He looked over his shoulder, his face as unreadable as ever, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Something he wasn't telling us. We move, he said, his voice low but firm. Keep it tight. Kefir grinned, though his usual confidence had started to fray at the edges. You heard the man. Let's see what all the fuss is about. He moved forward, leading the way into the darkness beyond the arch. I followed, reluctantly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that every step I took drew me deeper into a trap. As we crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted again. It wasn't just the cold, it was the wrongness of it, as if the air itself was suffocating us, sucking the warmth from our skin. The shadows seemed thicker here, deeper. There were no flickering lights now, only a constant eerie glow from the symbols on the walls. The floor beneath us was smooth stone, but it felt wrong, as though we were walking on something far more fragile, far more unnatural than rock. Rami was the first to speak again, his voice trembling with something more than fear. This place, it's not right. The air feels too thick, like it's closing in on us. I glanced back at him, but my attention was drawn to something on the far wall. A shape, something shifting at the edge of my vision. Edge. I blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. But the sensation lingered, a crawling unease that tightened around my chest. Dov, who had been mostly silent up until now, stopped suddenly, his hand clutching his comms pack. He looked at us, his expression drawn, his lips parted in disbelief. This can't be right. I'm getting a distortion. The frequencies are wrong. We all turned toward him. Distortion? Ziv asked, his voice steady but tinged with impatience. What kind of distortion? Dov's hands moved frantically over the equipment, but the more he adjusted, the worse it got. The static increased, an uncomfortable hiss that made my teeth ache. The signals, they're not just scrambled, they're collapsing on themselves. Like we're not even in the same place anymore. We shouldn't be able to transmit this close. I felt my throat tighten. What does that mean? I don't know, Dov replied, his voice breaking. But it's not normal. Something's wrong here. This place is feeding off the signals. It's alive. His words hung in the air, thick with the tension that had been steadily building since we entered the facility. The walls seemed to pulse more urgently now, as if responding to Dov's words, the symbols glowing brighter, their edges sharp and erratic. I glanced around, trying to keep my focus, but the shadows had begun to shift again, flickering at the edges of the room. No, not flickering, moving. I saw it then. A figure just at the edge of the room, barely visible in the dark. At first I thought it was one of us, one of my team members moving out of place. But as I looked closer, The shape didn't belong to any of us. It was humanoid, but too tall, its outline blurry, shifting like smoke. I blinked again, and it was gone. The air grew thick again, pressing in on us, almost suffocating. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the shadows becoming deeper, more oppressive. There was a sound now, low, guttural. It was coming from everywhere. No, it wasn't a sound at all. It was more of a feeling, a hum that rattled in the bones, a vibration that seemed to echo through my very being. "Everyone stay calm," Ziv's voice cut through the rising tension, but even he didn't sound entirely certain anymore. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, his hand moving slowly toward his weapon, his fingers tightening around the grip. I could see the unease in his eyes too now. We had all been trained for worst-case scenarios, but nothing in our training prepared us for this. Nothing prepared us for this. The feeling of reality itself bending, twisting, breaking down around us. It was as if the very laws of physics had begun to unravel. Another flicker of movement in the corner of my vision, this time unmistakable. I turned quickly, my hand reaching for my sidearm, but there was nothing there. The figure was gone. But when I turned back, Rami was staring at me, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed toward the far wall. At first I thought I saw nothing, but then, as my eyes adjusted to the low light, I saw it. The symbols were changing. The glow was no longer steady. It was undulating, shifting, as though they were alive. The shapes on the walls, the glyphs, they were moving. That's when I felt it. A chill, a deep, gut-wrenching cold that spread through my entire body. My heart stopped. Something was reaching out to us, and it wasn't just in the walls. It was in the very air we were breathing. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted, like the very foundation of reality was cracking under pressure. The walls pulsed with a steady, unsettling rhythm, as though the symbols themselves were breathing, alive, watching us. My heartbeat thudded in my chest, each beat reverberating through the silence like the drum of a far-off war. And then, it came again. The flicker. The shadows in the corners of the room danced like twisted silhouettes, flickering and bending in impossible angles. I couldn't focus on them long enough to make sense of what I was seeing, but I knew they were more than shadows. They were alive. They moved independently, creeping up the walls, reaching toward us with dark, grasping limbs that seemed to flicker between dimensions. The space around us stretched and contracted, the very geometry of the room warping as though it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. I took a step backward, but as I moved, I realized I wasn't alone. There were footprints in the dust. They were subtle at first, just impressions in the thick sand that had settled across the stone floor. But as I focused, I could see them clearer. The prints were unlike any I had ever seen. The deep indents in the dust were too large, too irregular. They were not human. They were massive, round, with sharp claw-like marks dragging across the surface as if something heavy had dragged itself through the chamber. There was no mistaking it. They were recent. The weight of them seemed to pull at the air itself, distorting it. Rami was the first to speak, his voice trembling with the shock of the discovery. This wasn't us. These prints, they're too large." Ziv was already moving, his eyes flicking from one shadow to the next, his expression unreadable. "Stay in formation. We're not alone. Stay alert." I swallowed hard, my throat tight, and tried to push the rising panic down. The shadows in the room were no longer confined to the edges. They had begun to stretch toward us, seeping across the floor like ink in water, slowly devouring the light. The air felt thick with malevolence, a tangible presence that grew heavier with each passing second. We moved slowly, cautiously, the weight of the silence pressing down on us. Every step was calculated, every breath shaky. Suddenly the temperature dropped again, so violently that I could see my breath, white and misty in the air. The cold was unnatural, like a sudden storm that had sprung from nowhere. The chill cut through my clothes, my skin, burrowing deep into my bones. I looked to my left at Kefir, his usual bravado replaced with an expression of deep unease. His hands twitched at his sides like he was desperate to reach for his weapons, but somehow knew it wouldn't help. "This isn't right," he muttered, almost to himself. "This place, it's not just abandoned, it's waiting." And that's when I saw it. A shape, rising slowly from the shadows. At first it was barely perceptible, just a distortion in the dark, a shift in the outline of the room. But then, it took form. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, rose from the floor like a mirage. Its body was obscured by shifting blackness, limbs elongating unnaturally. It didn't move in the way a human would. It drifted, as if the very laws of physics no longer applied to it. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure's head was bowed low, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, distant, and yet impossibly close. There was no discernible face, no features, just an empty space where something should have been. And then the sound, a low hum like a distant song vibrating through the air. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, more distinct, as though the figure was calling to us. "You're not meant to be here." The voice was like a distant echo, a tremor in the air that felt like it came from the deepest corners of the universe. The words weren't spoken aloud. They were felt. The very air around me seemed to vibrate with it, pressing in on my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I could hear the others behind me, their breathing quickening, their footsteps stuttering. The shadows were no longer just moving. They were chasing us, crawling along the walls and floor, stretching out like hungry tendrils, ready to pull us into the abyss. Ziv was the first to react, snapping his head back to us, his voice hoarse. "Move! Now!" We broke into a frantic run, but the shadows seemed to close in faster than we could escape. The flickering lights above us stuttered, casting our faces in erratic, broken flashes, the room warping and bending around us as we moved. The footprints, too, were multiplying, spreading like an infection across the floor, as though something was following us, or waiting. As we reached the far door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash, the impact shaking the entire room. The figure in the shadows stood still, unmoving, but its presence was suffocating. I felt the pressure closing in, choking the air from my lungs. A low whisper crawled from the walls, from the very ground beneath us. "You cannot leave." There was a moment, a fleeting second, where everything stopped. The shadows, the flickers, the coldness, all of it became still, as though the entire space was holding its breath. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It had just begun. I had never experienced anything like it. The air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy, as though the room itself was holding us in a vice, the walls closing in tighter with each passing moment. The hum that had been distant before now reverberated through our bones, a low, buzzing vibration that felt less like sound and more like something primal, something ancient, reaching out to us. It was as if the facility itself were alive, a living, breathing entity that knew we were here, and it had no intention of letting us leave. Ziv was still at the front, his eyes darting between the shadows, his weapon raised. He was focused, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his movements. His usual composure was slipping. He didn't speak. He couldn't. None of us could. There were no words for this. The darkness around us had grown thicker, more suffocating, pressing on our chests with the weight of an ancient secret. It was then that I saw it again. The figure. At first it was nothing more than a distortion in the shadows, a ripple at the corner of my vision. But as the seconds stretched into an eternity, it solidified. The air shimmered around it, warping, bending, as though it had no right to exist in the same space as us. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its limbs were elongated, stretching far beyond the proportions of anything human. The figure was not simply standing in the corner of the room. It hovered, its feet never quite touching the ground. It wasn't bound by the laws of physics or space. The thing, whatever it was draped in shadows that flickered like flame, and yet they were not shadows at all. They were alive, fluid, shifting, like the smoke from an otherworldly fire. I could feel its gaze even before it moved, a cold, empty presence that seemed to penetrate my very soul. I felt exposed as though my thoughts, my very being, were laid bare before it. "You should not have come." The voice reverberated through the air, not spoken aloud but felt. It was everywhere, inside our heads, inside our hearts. It was as if the words were seeping into the very fabric of our minds. They were not a warning, but a judgment, a simple statement of truth, like a mother telling a child they had trespassed where they shouldn't. I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nowhere to go. The air was thick, pressing against my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I could feel my heart racing, pounding against my ribs, as if it, too, was afraid. The shadows around me shifted, curling like tendrils, slowly drawing closer, each flicker of movement adding to the feeling that something far larger than us was present. It stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Its movements were smooth, graceful, but there was an unnaturalness to them, an eerie fluidity that defied the laws of nature. Its body stretched, then retracted, as if it were made of something intangible, something that could never be fully grasped. The shadows around it writhed, extending toward us like hungry fingers. The room, the very air, seemed to bow under its presence, as though reality itself was bending to its will. I tried to move, to speak, but the words died in my throat. There was no control. There was no will. Whatever this thing was, it had us. It owned us. It knew us. I wasn't sure if I was still breathing. I wasn't sure if the others were even there anymore. All I could feel was the presence of that thing. It was all there was. A force that pressed down on us, pulling us into its orbit. It wasn't angry, nor was it benevolent. It was indifferent, ancient and beyond comprehension. It was as though it had been waiting for us for eons, waiting for us to come to it. And now that we had, it was content to watch us writhe in the web of its presence. We need to move. Ziv's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that none of us had ever heard from him before. He was still holding his weapon, but the confidence in his posture had dissolved. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was no exit. There was only this, it. I could see Kafir's hands shaking, his weapon trembling in his grasp. He had always been the one to joke, the one to throw himself head first into danger. But now, there was no humor in his eyes. He was afraid. We all were. The thing in front of us was not just an enemy. It was the very thing that had brought us here, the purpose, the reason we had come into this forsaken place in the first place. The entity was still advancing, its shadowy form moving with a deliberate, almost playful grace. It was toying with us, drawing us closer to its reach. Each step it took seemed to warp the very space around it, the air becoming denser, thicker, heavier. I could feel the pressure building inside me, the suffocating weight of reality breaking apart, and then it stopped. There was a final, terrifying moment of stillness. The air stood frozen, and I realized something. This wasn't a creature. It wasn't even alive in any sense we understood. It was a presence, a force, something beyond time and space, a being of pure, unknowable energy. It was not here to destroy us. It was here to observe us, and as the shadow loomed closer, its presence pressing in on us like the crushing depths of the ocean, I knew we were the prey. The entity's presence was suffocating. I could feel it, not just with my senses, but with my very bones. It wasn't a physical force, not exactly, but something far more insidious, something that changed the very essence of what we were. There was no escape, no safe place within the room. It was as if the world itself was bending around us, warping into shapes we couldn't comprehend. I reached out instinctively, my hand trembling as it brushed the stone wall beside me. It was cold, unnaturally cold. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was the sensation, the feeling that surged through me the moment my fingers made contact. It wasn't stone beneath my skin. It was alive. I jerked my hand back as though I'd touched a live wire, and my heart raced in panic. My breath became shallow, erratic, as if the very air was becoming denser with each passing second. I could feel the presence tightening around us, suffocating us, and I realized something then. We were no longer in control of this mission. We were never meant to be. Rami was the first to show the signs. He stood motionless, his face pale, eyes wide and unblinking. But then, his eyes flickered, shifting from one corner to the next, as though he was seeing things that weren't there. And then, with a sudden sharp movement, he collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching his head. His breathing became erratic, frantic. "Rami!" I shouted, stepping toward him, but Ziv quickly pulled me back. "We don't know what's happening," Ziv murmured, his voice strained but steady. His eyes were fixed on Rami, who was now shaking violently. His body twitched, spasms running through him, as though something were moving underneath his skin. "We need to stay together." But it was too late. Rami's shaking slowed, and when he looked up at us, his eyes weren't his own. They were glassy, unfocused, empty, as though they had been replaced with something else. Something alien. He opened his mouth, but the words that came out weren't his. "It is here. You cannot leave." The voice was not his. It wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, but also impossibly distant, as though it echoed from a place beyond time, a place that had no right to exist. Ziv's grip on his weapon tightened. "Get him up. We need to move now." But as I reached for Rami, I felt something pull at my mind, a strange sensation that made my head spin. For a split second, I thought I saw the walls shift, not just in the way they had before, but in a way that defied every law of physics I had ever known. The stone was breathing. The shadows on the walls writhed like snakes. They reached out toward Rami, toward us, as if the entire room itself had become alive. I staggered back, my pulse hammering in my chest. The air was becoming heavier, thicker, with each passing moment. And that's when I noticed it. The symbols on the walls, those same symbols that had glowed so faintly when we first entered, were now pulsating violently, their light flickering erratically. But it wasn't just the light that disturbed me. It was the shape of them. They were shifting, warping and changing before our eyes. They weren't static. They weren't symbols at all. They were runes, a language that was never meant to be read by human eyes. Kfir's laughter echoed through the chamber, sharp and unsettling, but there was no joy in it. "This is madness." He was holding his weapon tight, but his hands were shaking, his voice cracking. "We're trapped. We're already dead." But his words were not just born from fear. They were born from something else, something deeper. As I turned toward him, I saw that his face was contorted in an expression of pure agony. His body was trembling violently now, his breath shallow. His eyes darted around the room, but they were unfocused, like his very consciousness was splitting apart. Suddenly there was a crack, a sickening sound, sharp and unnatural, like a bone breaking. Kfir let out a guttural scream, his body writhing. Something was inside him. Something not human. His hands clenched into fists, his nails biting into the skin of his palms. And then, as if on cue, the air around him seemed to distort, ripple, and he collapsed to the ground. I rushed to him, pulling him up, but the moment my hand touched his shoulder, I felt it. The pressure. It wasn't just physical. It was mental. His body had become impossibly cold, and his skin had turned ashen, a sickly gray that was wrong. His pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow, but there was something else behind his eyes. A darkness that I couldn't comprehend. Ziv's voice was a command. "We need to keep moving. This will only get worse. Stay focused." But the words rang hollow. The deeper we went, the less human we all felt. Dov had been silent for too long, but I felt his presence before I saw him. His fingers were twitching uncontrollably at his side, and when I turned to look at him, his gaze was vacant, disconnected, as though he wasn't even aware we were there. He spoke, but the words that came from his mouth were broken, distorted, like a radio caught between two frequencies. "It is in the air. It is in you." His voice was cracked, the sound an alien distortion, like something that wasn't supposed to exist. He took a slow step forward, but the way he moved was not human. It was as if he were floating, his feet barely touching the ground, his body swaying in ways that didn't make sense. "We need to leave." Rami's voice cut through the tension, low and haunted. "This place is feeding on us." But it was too late. There was no leaving. The entity wasn't simply observing anymore. It was altering us, changing us from the inside out. We were becoming part of its world now, drawn deeper into its web, unable to escape. We were no longer just operatives on a mission. We were vessels. And whatever it was, whatever it had awakened, we were now at its mercy. We were no longer just a team of soldiers. We were fragments, isolated, broken by the very force that had brought us here. The shadows seemed to twist and pulse with an energy all their own, a rhythm, an ancient beat that seemed to seep into our very souls. The room had ceased to be just a room. It was alive, and it knew us. It had waited, watched, and now it was claiming us. Kfir was the first to scream. It was raw, a guttural cry that tore through the thick, suffocating silence. His back arched as though something inside him was breaking free, his body trembling violently. His hands clutched at his chest, fingers digging into his skin as if trying to pull the force out of him. But it wasn't just physical, it was mental. His eyes rolled back and his mouth opened, but no words came. Only a horrific, low sound, like something far older than human language, something from deep within the earth itself. It was a scream, yes, but it was otherworldly, as though Kfir wasn't in control anymore. I reached for him, desperate, but before I could touch him, the walls around us began to shift again. The air was vibrating now, a constant hum that rattled our bones. And then, the breach. It happened so suddenly. One moment we were struggling to keep ourselves together, the next, the stone itself broke. The floor cracked, the very foundation of the facility splitting apart like it was made of glass. A deep, rumbling sound reverberated through the walls, a shockwave of energy that slammed into my chest. The pressure around us was unbearable, as if the entire room were about to collapse in on itself. I tried to speak, but no words came. All I could hear was the hum, the overwhelming vibration that seemed to grow louder with each passing second, a sound so deep that it felt like it was coming from the core of the planet itself. The shadows exploded outward, filling the room, crawling up the walls, flowing through the cracks in the floor. They surged toward us, reaching, crawling, twisting like hungry serpents. I could see them now, the shapes, humanoid, faceless, with limbs that stretched far too long, far too thin. They moved through the shadows like sentient smoke, their outlines warping with every flicker. And in the center of it all, the entity. It was no longer hidden in the corners, no longer a shape in the shadows. It had taken form, an enormous presence, towering over us. Its form was shifting, indefinable, an amalgamation of darkness and light, an endless writhing mass of energy. It had no face, no features, no eyes. It was just presence. It was the absence of everything, and yet it was everything. A void, a gap in reality itself. "You have awakened me." The voice came again, deeper now, filling my mind like a flood. It wasn't speaking through sound. It was speaking through thought, through the very fabric of reality. The words weren't heard. They were felt, imprinted on our consciousness. I staggered backward, my head swimming with the pressure of it. The force of the words shook me, rattled me down to my core. It was as though reality itself was warping around us, folding into something beyond understanding. The ground trembled, and the air hummed with an energy so raw, so primal, that it threatened to tear us apart. Ziv's voice broke through the madness, sharp and commanding. "Get to the exit now." But the door, the one we had entered through, was no longer there. The walls had shifted, reconfigured. The space around us had become an infinite maze of twisted stone, each passage leading deeper into the darkness. We were trapped. There was no escape. The shadows pressed in tighter, the dark shapes creeping closer, their twisted limbs reaching for us with an unrelenting hunger. I looked at Rami, his face twisted in agony, his hands clutching at his head as if he were trying to keep himself from breaking apart. His eyes were still distant, haunted. "It's inside me," he whispered. "It's inside all of us." The words were barely audible, but they were enough. Enough to make the blood drain from my face. Dove's figure flickered, his form warping like a broken image on a television screen. He was changing, his body contorting in unnatural ways, as though the very fabric of his being was being rewritten. His voice came through, a garbled static of sounds that barely made sense, but the message was clear. We were becoming part of it. I turned toward Fear, but before I could reach him, he was lifted off the ground. The shadows had wrapped around him, twisting through the air like vines, pulling him into the dark mass of the entity. He screamed again, his body convulsing in a way that no human body should. And then, in an instant, the scream stopped. The shadows swallowed him whole. There was no trace left. My mind broke in that moment. I tried to move, tried to pull away from the growing darkness, but my limbs refused to obey. It was as if the air itself was thickening, pressing down on me, and the walls of reality were crumbling. The ground beneath us cracked open, revealing nothing but an endless abyss, an emptiness that seemed to call to us, pull us deeper. And then I saw it. The entity reached out, a mass of swirling blackness and impossible shapes, its form folding in on itself like liquid metal. Its limbs stretched toward me, and I could feel its presence inside my skull, crawling through my thoughts, suffocating my very consciousness. There were no words, no voice, but I understood. It was waiting. It didn't need to destroy us. It didn't need to consume us. It simply needed us to cease, to be forgotten. And as I was pulled into the void, the last thing I understood was that it wasn't a matter of life or death. It was a matter of time. Time itself was bending, breaking, collapsing into the endless, cyclical emptiness of the entity. And as it consumed me, I realized we were never meant to leave. I woke with a start. My chest heaved as I gasped for breath, the air sharp and dry, as if I had been suffocating for hours. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The reality I had fallen into was not the same as before. Something had shifted. The room, the walls, they were different. The shadows were gone. The hum that had rattled through my bones had stopped. I reached out instinctively, my hands trembling as I fumbled for something, anything, to steady myself. The floor beneath me was cold, hard stone. I pulled myself up, blinking against the harsh, unnatural light that filled the room. It wasn't like the dim, suffocating glow we had seen before. This light was too bright, too clean, like it was designed to erase every trace of what had been. The air around me felt wrong, too still, too empty. I glanced around, my senses reeling, but what I saw was impossible. The facility had changed. The walls, once made of jagged stone and dark symbols, now appeared smooth. Too smooth, as though they had been polished and reshaped. The symbols were gone. The oppressive weight of the shadows, the fear that had twisted around us was no longer there. But the feeling remained. The wrongness. I tried to call out, but my voice was hoarse, like I hadn't spoken in days. "Ziv?" I croaked. "Kafir? Dove? Rami?" There was no answer. I staggered to my feet, disoriented. My body felt heavy, as though it were made of lead. I was struggling to piece together what had happened, but the memories were fractured, broken in places like pages torn out of a book. The last thing I clearly remembered was the entity, the darkness, the overwhelming presence that had twisted everything around us. But now, there was only silence. I moved forward cautiously, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, expecting something to jump out at me. The door was open, an unnatural light spilling from the hallway beyond. It was too easy, too quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air still felt wrong, heavy with the echoes of something that shouldn't be there. It felt like an alien landscape, as though the entire space had been rearranged by forces I couldn't comprehend. I stumbled forward, unsure of what was real anymore, unsure of whether I was even awake. But I had to find the others. I had to. There was no choice. I reached the hallway and froze. The world around me seemed to distort, the walls pulsing with a faint, almost imperceptible rhythm. The air vibrated as if the facility itself was alive, breathing. The light flickered, casting sharp, jagged shadows that twisted unnaturally, stretching and shrinking at impossible angles. I felt the floor beneath me tremble just slightly, as if the very ground was aware of my presence. And then, from somewhere deep within the facility, a sound, distant but unmistakable. A whisper. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the whisper grew louder, closer. It wasn't a human voice. It was not language, but something far older, more guttural. The walls seemed to be speaking. No, not speaking. They were calling. The hum returned, faint, but still there, crawling beneath my skin. I turned toward the sound, my instincts screaming at me to run, to escape, but my body refused to move. The whisper grew louder, clearer, more demanding. It echoed in my skull. It was the same voice, the one that had called to us before, the one that had told us we had awakened it. "You cannot leave." The words scraped across my mind like jagged nails, the pressure of them growing unbearable. I could feel the walls closing in again, the space shrinking, warping. The hallway stretched out before me, but it was no longer a path to freedom. It was a trap, a loop that would never end. I was trapped again, trapped in a place where time and reality no longer held sway. The facility was no longer just an environment. It was a prison, and the thing that had awaited us, that entity, was still here. But then, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was Ziv. His face was hollow, his eyes vacant, as though he was staring straight through me. He was standing perfectly still, his body rigid, his posture stiff, unnaturally still. But it was the way he moved that chilled me. He didn't walk toward me. He floated, his body drifting slowly through the air, his feet never touching the ground. His skin was ashen, gray like a corpse, and his mouth was hanging open, but no sound came out. He wasn't alive anymore. I took a step back, my heart racing, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Ziv's body continued to drift toward me, his arms outstretched, his fingers twitching. And with each inch he moved, the temperature dropped, the air growing colder and colder, until I could see my breath condense in front of me. His voice came again, distorted, like a whisper through a veil. "You cannot escape." It wasn't just Ziv anymore. It was all of us. We were all becoming it, becoming part of the very thing that had ensnared us. I turned, running with everything I had, my legs screaming in protest. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if there was an escape anymore. But I ran. I ran until I hit the walls. I ran until I was gasping for breath, my chest burning with the effort. But no matter how fast I moved, the hallway never ended. It just kept stretching, longer, farther, until the light in front of me began to flicker, dimming as though the very power source was being drained. The space itself seemed to breathe, collapsing in on itself. The shadows twisted and closed around me like hungry tendrils. I fell to my knees. I couldn't breathe. The walls around me groaned, vibrating with a low, humming energy. The hum was deafening now, rattling my teeth, my bones. And then, I saw it again, the entity. It was everywhere, its shape no longer confined to one place. It filled every inch of the facility, flowing through the walls, slipping through cracks. It was part of the air, part of the light, part of the very space we had once inhabited. We were already gone. The escape was a lie. There was nowhere to run. I don't know how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity, a fractured span where time lost all meaning. The walls around me pressed in, suffocating, until I could barely tell if I was still in the facility or if I had drifted into some other place altogether. My legs were shaking. My mind was unraveling. There was no escaping the truth of it. Whatever was happening to us, whatever we had become, it was irreversible. The last thing I remember clearly was the sound, the hum, the deep, resonant vibration that had filled every corner of the facility. But then there was silence, a kind of unnatural stillness that settled in the air like a fog. It was then that I realized I was not alone anymore. I was no longer the same person. My body felt strange, alien. My thoughts drifted like whispers in my head, detached from reality. I could feel the pull of the entity, the weight of its influence creeping inside me, changing me. I was no longer just a soldier. I was becoming it, and it was becoming me. That's when I saw them. Rami was the first. He had found me, or I had found him. Either way, we were both lost. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide and unblinking. But they were wrong. They weren't his anymore. They were empty, hollow, like something that had once been human but was now filled with something far older, far more alien. He was standing still, like a mannequin, but there was a twitch in his hand, as if his body was trying to resist, trying to fight what had already taken hold of him. His voice came in a low rasp, a sound that wasn't quite his own. It felt like an echo, a fragment of something distant. "It is inside," he whispered, his voice trembling, but there was no fear in it, only resignation. "I can feel it. I am it." It was then that I realized I wasn't the only one who had been changed. We all had. We had been altered. Fear appeared next, his figure staggering toward me from the shadows. His face was twisted, unrecognizable, his mouth stretched in a grotesque grin that didn't belong to him. His eyes, however, were still the same, wide with terror, but there was something else in them too, something that made my skin crawl. Knowledge. His body was shaking, his fingers twitching as though they were struggling to maintain their humanity. He opened his mouth, and I half expected him to scream, but instead, he exhaled a low, guttural sound. It wasn't a word. It was a vibration, a hum that matched the frequency of the entity. "It's not just us," he muttered, his voice raw. "It's everything. We're part of it now." His body flickered, his form blurring at the edges like a glitch in reality. For a moment I saw something behind his eyes, a darkness, a shadow that stretched too far across his soul. It was as if the entity had carved itself into him, changing him from the inside out. Dav was next, his presence silent, like a ghost. He appeared beside Rami, his face slack, his expression absent. But when I looked closer, I saw the faint hum of energy swirling around him, the very air bending to his form. His lips barely moved when he spoke, but I heard it all the same. "The signal is stronger now." It wasn't just his voice anymore. It was other voices, a chorus of thoughts and whispers that spoke through him. His body shuddered, and I could see the lines of his form morph, the edges of his being becoming blurry, unstable. It was as though he was being rewritten, his very cells rearranging themselves by an intelligence far beyond anything we could understand. He was being used as a conduit, a way for the entity to reach out into our world. I turned away from them, from the twisted faces that were once my comrades. I couldn't bear to look at them anymore. They weren't them. They were something else, something that had become part of this place, part of the entity that had taken everything from us. And then there was Ziv. He was the last one. I saw him standing in the doorway, his eyes empty, like a shell of what he had been. He was still wearing his combat gear, but his posture was stiff, unnatural. He looked too still, as if the very air around him had frozen. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I saw the flicker of recognition. But it wasn't Ziv anymore. It was something else, something that had taken his place. "You cannot run from it," Ziv's voice came. But it wasn't him. The words were spoken with his mouth, but they carried the weight of something ancient, something that had waited for far too long. "We are its children now." He stepped forward, and it was like the very ground bent to his will. I could feel the pressure in the air, the weight of his words pressing on me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I wanted to move. I wanted to escape, but I was paralyzed, trapped in place by a force greater than any fear I had ever known. There was no escape anymore. We were part of it. We had always been part of it. The room started to shift again. The walls warbled, flickered, as if reality itself were tearing apart at the seams. The light bent in unnatural ways. It was happening. Time was collapsing. It was swallowing everything. Our bodies, our souls, our very minds. I felt my heart stop. We were not human anymore. We had been absorbed into the fabric of something far larger, far older, far beyond the confines of our understanding. We were no longer ourselves. We were its vessels. And we were trapped forever in its grasp. The extraction should have been smooth. It should have been routine. The chopper should have arrived, and we should have been airlifted out of that cursed place. But nothing about this mission had been routine. Nothing about us, or the facility, was as it seemed. And when we emerged from the depths of the facility, there was no sense of victory. There was no relief. Only a cold, suffocating silence that followed us like a shadow. A presence that clung to us, refused to let us go. When we reached the extraction point, no one spoke. Ziv didn't give any orders, Kafir didn't crack any jokes, and Dov didn't fiddle with his comms equipment. We just stood there, waiting for the helicopter, our bodies stiff and unwilling to move. Each of us felt the weight of the place we had just left hanging over us, a burden we could never shed. There was nothing in the air except the hum, that insistent buzzing vibration that we could still feel, even here, even on the surface. The hum that had followed us back, that was now buried deep within our bones. The helicopter arrived, descending with a low whine, its rotor blades slicing through the still air. It was a welcome sound, but it didn't bring relief. As we boarded, I glanced at my teammates. They weren't the same. They couldn't be. We were all different. Our eyes were glassy, hollow. No one spoke. We just sat, each of us lost in the hollow silence that seemed to envelop everything now. As the helicopter took off, I glanced back at the desert below. The facility, the place that had once been so ominous, was gone. It wasn't just a matter of it being out of sight. It was as if it had never existed at all. The horizon was barren, empty, as though the earth itself had erased it from the land. I felt a sinking feeling in my chest, like the world was slowly closing in on me. The rest of the ride was uneventful, too uneventful. No one spoke. The atmosphere inside the chopper was thick with an unspoken understanding. The longer we flew, the more the weight of it all settled on us. We weren't just coming back from a mission. We were returning from a place where time, space, and reality didn't behave the way they were supposed to. A place where the laws of nature no longer had any meaning. The moment we landed, the doors to the safe house opened immediately. There was no formal greeting, no debriefing, just cold, sterile efficiency. The team was ushered into a sterile briefing room, small, functional, and devoid of any personal touch. I could barely register the officers who greeted us. They moved with a kind of practiced indifference, as if they had seen this before. But there was something else in their eyes, a coldness that didn't quite match their calm demeanor. We were seated, our faces blank, as the medical and psychological staff began their work. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They knew. They knew the look in our eyes, the way we carried ourselves now, as if the weight of something ancient and incomprehensible had been placed on our shoulders. But the questions didn't come. There were no detailed reports, no investigation into what had happened. Instead, the officers began the suppression process, efficiently and without hesitation. My own mind was foggy, blurred. There were gaps in my memory, places where things had been erased, wiped clean, like chalk on a blackboard. I remembered the desert. I remembered the facility. I remembered the entity, its voice, its presence. But now, it was all fading, as if they were distant dreams, slipping away with every passing second. I tried to speak, to ask the questions that were clawing at my mind, but every time I opened my mouth, the words didn't come out right. It was like my thoughts had become tangled, unable to find their way to my lips. Every sentence I tried to form twisted itself into something else. The suppression had already begun. They were rewriting the truth. Ziv, sitting across from me, did not meet my eyes. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight, his expression unreadable. But I knew what he was thinking. He was still in the grip of it. We all were. "You'll be reassigned," one of the officers said, his voice flat. He didn't look at us as he spoke, as though he were reading from a script. New roles, new assignments. You'll continue your work. This never happened. I nodded, though I felt the bile rise in my throat. This never happened. The words felt hollow. I knew they were lying, but I couldn't fight it. The truth, the real truth, was something I could no longer grasp. It was being buried under layers of lies, sealed away in some non-existent archive where it would stay forever. It was the only way they could protect themselves. Your memories will be altered. The officer's voice broke through my thoughts. You will be given new directives. The mission will be erased from your mind. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I could feel the pressure building in my skull, like my mind was being compressed, the details of the mission fading into the black void. They weren't just erasing what had happened. They were altering us, changing us. They had to. They couldn't let the truth get out. They couldn't let anyone else know what had really happened down there. I was taken away for evaluation, but there was no evaluation, there was no discussion. They didn't need to ask. They knew. The operation was over. It wasn't until much later, when I sat in my apartment staring at the empty walls, that I understood. The entity was still with us. It was in our memories, in our minds, waiting for the right moment to unleash itself again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark shape. I heard the hum. It was always there, just behind the veil of reality, always watching, always waiting. And no matter how much I tried to suppress it, I knew it was still there. It would never let us go. It has been weeks since I returned. At least, I think it's been weeks. Time has become a blur, a stretching, elastic thing that never quite fits together. I sit in my apartment, the walls feeling like they're closing in, the air thick with a weight I can't describe. I've tried to pretend that everything is normal, but I can't. I know it's not. I feel it every time I close my eyes, every time I walk into a room, every time I hear a sound that shouldn't be there. I sit at my desk, the same desk where I've written countless reports, all of them lies now. The words I've written, everything, feels wrong. The paper, the ink, the letters, they're all twisted, as if reality itself is trying to erase them. The truth won't stay in my mind. It slips away like water through my fingers, and all that remains are pieces, fragments of things I can't put together. The shadows in my apartment are strange too. They move, sometimes in the corner of my eye, sometimes in the corners of the room. They twist and stretch like they're alive, like they're watching me, waiting for me to slip up. There are nights when I swear I hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, far too loud for a building this empty. And I know what it is. I know what's following me. I don't have to see it to feel it. It's there, always, in the shadows, in the dark. I've checked my watch 3 times today, but each time it tells me something different. The time doesn't make sense. The clock should be accurate, right? But it's not. The hands shift when I'm not looking, and the numbers blink in ways they shouldn't. The air tastes metallic, like I'm breathing in something toxic, something that doesn't belong. It's the same taste I had when I was in the facility, the same taste in my mouth when I first saw it, when I first felt the entity's presence. I thought I had escaped. I thought I had left it behind. But it never left me. It never let go. The hum is still with me, too. That deep, vibrating hum that crawls into my head and settles beneath my skull, like it's a part of me now. I can hear it when I try to sleep, when I try to focus on anything other than the emptiness that surrounds me. It's always there. I can't get rid of it. I can't shake it. Tonight, I walked out of my apartment, hoping for a few minutes of peace. I wandered the streets aimlessly, trying to forget, trying to escape the memories, but it was no use. The city felt wrong, too. The lights were too bright, the shadows too deep, as if the whole world had been distorted, pulled out of alignment. And when I looked up, I saw them, the shadows, stretching across the buildings like limbs, crawling down the walls toward me. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the shadows, they moved. I could see them stretch and twist in ways that didn't make sense. They didn't just bend. They shifted, slithered, like they were alive. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned, as I ran back toward my apartment. But the streets weren't right. They were changing too. The path I had taken was no longer the same. The buildings were different. The sky was darker, the stars wrong. Nothing made sense. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. I made it back inside, but it didn't help. The shadows were waiting for me. I could feel them in the corners of the room, creeping closer, wrapping around me. The hum was louder now, and as I looked into the darkened corner of my apartment, I saw them, the shapes. Twisted, indistinct figures, barely human, but stretching into forms that were too long, too strange to be anything of this world. I should have closed my eyes, but I couldn't. I had to look. I had to understand. They were moving, reaching, toward me. I could hear their whispers, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the very air, a voice that spoke in ways my mind couldn't process. It wasn't just one voice, it was many. It was all the voices, the ones from the facility, from the entity that had watched us, that had changed us. And then, a final whisper. The same one I had heard in the facility, the one that had judged us. It echoed in my head, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my very bones. The entity is patient. It doesn't need to destroy us. It can wait for us to finish destroying ourselves. And that's when I understood. We are the fuel for it. We always have been. Everything we did, everything we thought was a choice, a free will, it wasn't. It was part of the plan. We're its vessels, its servants, its soldiers. And we don't even know it. We are still part of it, even here, in the dark, in the quiet. I hear the footsteps again, too heavy to be human. They echo outside my door. And I know it's waiting. The walls are thick with its presence, the shadows crawling like hungry tendrils. And I know I will never escape. I cannot escape. It's not just in the facility. It's not just in the dark spaces of the world. It's inside me, inside all of us, waiting, watching, and it can wait. Because it knows we'll destroy ourselves long before it has to.